An account of the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, and Judah the father of Perez and Terah by Tamar, and Perez the father of Hezron, and Hezron the father of Aram, and Aram the father of Abinadab, and Abinadab the father of Nashon, and Nashon the father of Solomon, and Solomon the father of Boaz by Rahab, and Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of King David. You with me so far? And David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah, and Solomon the father of Rehoboam, and Rehoboam the father of Abjab, and Abjab the father of Asaph, and Asaph the father of Jehoshaphat, and Jehoshaphat the father of Joram, and Joram the father of Uzziah, and Uzziah the father of Joam, and Joam the father of Ahaz, and Ahaz the father of Hezekiah, and Hezekiah the father of Manasseh, and Manasseh the father of Amos, and Amos the father of Joab, and Joash the father of Joachim and his brothers, and the time of the deportation to Babylon. Go with me. And after the deportation to Babylon, Joachim became the father of Samatha, and Samatha the father of Zerubbabel, and Zerubbabel the father of Abin, and Abin the father of Acham, and Acham the father of Azor, and Azor the father of Zadok, and Zadok the father of Achim, and Achim the father of Elud, and Elud the father of Eliezer, and Eliezer the father of Mathan, and Mathan the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called the Messiah. My father's parents met in an unusual way. They met by correspondence. My grandfather was a miner. Well, we all are until we turn 18. He was a lead miner in eastern and southern Missouri, and back in the early 1900s, the Osage tribe had a going oil business out northwest of Tulsa, and there were a lot of rich families because of that oil and because they had a good lawyer that got the tribe mineral rights. And so my grandfather went out to work for a family near Huska, Oklahoma, right on the Arkansas River. And I don't know exactly how many years he was out there or exactly what he was doing. He was a farmer and a blacksmith as well as a miner. And there was a woman who had married a gentleman from that area, and she was from Webster County, Missouri, and she was good friends of my grandmother. And my grandmother's friend, as well as others, were kind of worried about her because she was getting up in her 30s, and she did not have a suitor. And so she kind of liked my grandfather and thought he might be a good match for my grandmother. And so on one of her travels back to Missouri, she suggested that they might correspond, which they did for a time. And after, I don't know how long this went on, but they agreed that they would meet at the courthouse in Marshfield, Missouri, county seat. And if they could stand each other's looks, that they would get married. So my grandfather traveled by train and met my grandmother on the square. They each had a rose in their lapel so they could identify who they were. And after talking a while, they went to the courthouse and got their marriage license. And then a little while later, they were married in the little town of Beach, Missouri, by my grandmother's brother, who was a Methodist minister. There seemed to be a number of Methodist ministers on her side of the family. And he told them it was a good time of year to get married because there weren't too many flies. You can tell he was a romantic and could turn a phrase. So after their marriage, they took the train back to Fairfax, Oklahoma, and took a wagon pulled by 2 oxen back to Missouri and started trying to farm on 40 acres of rocks. You probably have a story in your background that might inform who you are today. We can get tons of genealogical information now by spitting into a tube. As I did that a few years ago, I was trying to think, was there any serious crime that I had committed that I had forgotten about that left DNA evidence? I hope not. So after a few weeks, I got a letter back from Ancestry.com explaining, where supposedly my ancestors were from. And then I got other information about possible cousins who have also spit into a tube and have ties to your DNA, and also that's all been somewhat interesting through the years. We're pretty sophisticated how we do our family trees these days. We have lots of resources. But before they were Ancestry.com and before the Mormons had such massive records, and before there was the records in the town halls, or family Bibles with birth and death pages, genealogical lists were often oral. And they were remembered because they're significant. The Bible has quite a few genealogies because it was important to establish ties to people in the history of Israel. These other genealogies, beside the one in Matthew you read this morning, are only male. Astonishingly, Matthew traces Jesus' ancestry through all the generations back to Abraham. And in the long list of people, which I actually didn't pronounce some of those correctly, there are mentioned 4 women. And the 4 women have astonishing stories. Tamar, the first one mentioned, and her story is in Genesis, the 38th chapter, was the mother of twin sons by Judah, one of the brothers of Joseph. And one of them, Perez, was Jesus' ancestor. This was before the time the people of Israel went to Egypt. Tamar had been the wife of 2 of Judah's 3 sons. Each of the sons had died. And the Bible says that God killed them because they were wicked. It was the custom for the younger brother to marry the widow so that the line of the brother could continue with children. But Judah was not too keen on giving his youngest son to this woman, Tamar, because he would kind of concede that she was bad luck. And besides, his son was young. So he told Tamar to go back to her father's house. And there she languished in the tents of the women, poor, dressed in widow's rags, and with a miserable future ahead of her. But she did submit to this fate, well, for a while. And then Tamar heard the news that Judah's wife had died, and then a few months later he was going to go on a journey. He wanted to check on the shearing of his sheep. So Tamar found out about his plans, and she went ahead of him to a crossroads, dressed in heavy makeup and wearing a veil as a woman for sale. Judah came and saw her, and he offered a young goat for her services. But she demanded cash. So he gave her his signet ring and his belt and his staff as signs of his patriarchy and good faith for her to hold until payment arrived later. One of his servants returned sometime later with this young kid, and they could not find this woman. No one seemed to know who she was or where she went. And things continued as they were for a bit of time. And then about 3 months later, there was a scandal in the family of Tamar in her home because she was pregnant. And Judah, the head of the clan, demanded that she be brought to him and sentenced to die by burning because she had become pregnant. Well, Tamar does a little sleight of hand and produces his ring, his belt, and his staff, saying, "These belong to the father of her child." And Judah says, "She is more righteous than I, for I did not give her my living son." And she bore twins, and Perez was one of them and carried her lineage to Jesus. Have you heard that story before? Genesis chapter 38. We jump ahead 7 generations after the captivity in Egypt, where Charlton Heston came and rescued the people and led them for 40 years wandering in the wilderness till they conquered Canaan. And when Joshua, who was the leader after the death of Moses, sent 2 spies into this new territory of Canaan, especially the city of Jericho, they ended up spending the night in the house of Rahab, a prostitute in Jericho. And of course, a foreigner, a Canaanite. Now, the authorities in Jericho got wind of this large group of people that seemed poised to invade their land, and that there were spies in the city. So they came hunting to kill them. But Rahab, recognizing there was going to be a war and sensing the Israelites would win, hid the Israeli men on a roof and later lowered them down over the city wall, saving their lives. In return, she asked that she and her household be spared when war came. And they were. And she lived the rest of her life among the Israelis, eventually marrying one, having a child. And Rahab is sometimes called the mother of Israel. We jump ahead only 1 generation, this time to Ruth. There was a young widow without children and a foreigner in Israel. In their day, she and her widowed mother-in-law, Naomi, were in dire straits because their husbands had died. They had no men to provide for them. Naomi wanted to return to her own country, but Ruth would not let her die alone and insisted on making the journey with her back to Bethlehem, where Ruth would be a foreigner. There, Naomi's wealthy cousin named Boaz gave Ruth special privileges. She had kind of caught his eye and allowed her, a foreigner, to eat with his harvesters and to glean in the fields, which the poor were allowed to come in and take what was left after harvest. Naomi suggested that Ruth seduce Boaz, and she did. And they bore a son named Obed, who became a forefather to Jesus. 3 generations later, we read about a woman named Bathsheba. Matthew calls her the wife of Uriah the Hittite, but we know her by the name of Bathsheba. Uriah was a general in David's army and had a remarkable, beautiful wife. And while there was war going on, David was at home in Jerusalem and spotted this woman on a rooftop near his palace. And the woman was bathing, and he was quite smitten by her and ordered his soldiers to bring her to him. Bathsheba became pregnant by David. Uriah was called home for a furlough. Spend some time with your wife, David said, but he refused to spend time at home away from his troops. He said it was not fair them fighting while I am here home enjoying the pleasures of my wife's company. So David sent him back to battle and arranged for the troops around him to withdraw so that he would be killed. Bathsheba became a widow, and David married her. That child she bore died. And the prophet Samuel said it was because of David's sin. But later David and Bathsheba had another child named Solomon. And Bathsheba guided his path to the throne, and he became the greatest of all the kings of Israel. I wonder why Matthew made a point of mentioning these women, 4 women, as foremothers of Jesus. He broke tradition to include them in his list. These women have things in common. Their survival was at stake. They had grit and determination. They were clever, if not sly, in their ability to turn their lives around. And each of them exhibited kindness and mercy. Tamar for Judah's mourning, Rahab for the terrified spies, Ruth for Naomi, Bathsheba for David, her abuser. Jesus showed compassion continually for women, and his foremothers, and maybe socializing with them and rebuking men who spoke ill of women had to do with his lineage. Matthew knew this and showed how important these women were to Israel and the coming of the Messiah. Matthew was not the first gospel written in the form we know it today. That was Mark, written some 15 years earlier. Of course, that was 20 or 30 years after the writing of Paul. But Matthew is the first record of the miraculous birth of Jesus, a story that Matthew chooses to tell through the eyes of Joseph, engaged to Mary, Jesus' mother. And it is Joseph's genealogy we hear. It is not news to you to know you're living in a time of great change. The internet, cell phones, change how we communicate, even how we react with the world around us. A couple of years ago, Time magazine announced the Person of the Year were the silence breakers, women who have begun to speak out about sexual harassment and abuse. A good change. Hooray for the places in the world that give women equal rights. Hooray for the courage of women and girls to speak out and bring justice to their abusers. Hooray for those who have found strength to open the old scabs of hurt and shame so that they can find healing. Matthew does 2 important things in his genealogy of Jesus. He traces the history of Joseph, the husband of Mary, and he includes women. Women whose stories are complicated and messy. But this is how God always works. God transforms lives in amazing ways. We read in the scriptures of a Jesus that was not put off by complicated and messy. He did not seem to be put off by much of anything. Well, maybe he didn't have patience with the shallow religiosity and false piety that he saw. And Matthew's Christmas story is not about miracles. It's about God interacting with life to create wholeness, helping people to live freely, love extravagantly, find the courage to fight for justice when the system is against you. I assume, like most of us, that Jesus knew his family history. Maybe it was one of the reasons he was so inclusive of women. Indeed, he was inclusive of everyone in all that he said and did. Life can be messy, but in the mess, there is redemption.